Good afternoon, brothers and sisters. Before we begin, let us pray. Almighty and everlasting God, who's given unto thy servants grace, by the confession of the true faith, to acknowledge the glory of the eternal Trinity, and in the power of divine majesty, to worship you, the one true and living God. We beseech you that you would give to us and keep us steadfast in this faith by thine omnipotent hand, and evermore defend us from all adversities, spiritual or physical. You, O living and true God, who reigns one God, world without end. Amen. Well, we return in our studies with Professor John Murray on the book of Romans, and I've reflected in a few other videos that Professor Murray is my theological and exegetical grandfather. In old Princeton, before that, Prof. Murray comes through the line of the systematics department that I had at Westminster. Most thankfully, I'm glad I went there, through the Presbyterian side, but also through the Reformed Episcopal side, and Bishop Theophilus Herder, who did his PhD or THD under John Murray. And we were the recipients of that precision of Bishop Herder in our Greek classes as we were at Westminster. So I got a degree from both seminaries, and in that tradition as a Reformed Anglican, with Grandpa Murray, as I'm going to start calling him. We opened up last time a little summary on the author, Paul. It's not disputed in the New Testament Guild. It's interpreted differently in the New Testament Guild, but we'll leave that for a later time. Now we'll close that discussion briefly and then talk about the occasion for St. Paul's writing of the letter, and we'll be in that for the rest of our segment and maybe tomorrow, God willing. There's another issue concerned with Pauline authorship that ought to be noted. By way of eminence, Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles, and we'll add per agreement, as noted in Galatians 2, that he would do the Gentiles and Peter would work with the Jews. Right there. There's no Petrine supremacy arising out of Rome or out of Jerusalem. I marveled at Benedict XVI, formerly Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, schooled with the liberal Protestants in Bavarian, from the area of Bavaria, a first-rate scholar as the recent Pope, now in retirement. But he wondered why Protestants didn't make more of Galatians 2, with Paul going to the Gentiles and Peter to the Jews, as a Protestant argument against Petrine supremacy. I remember reading that and thinking at the time, who are you talking about, Mr. Pope? I thought this for a long time. And just as a historical footnote, I would refer you to Professor Charles Hodge's letter to the Vatican declining attendance. The letter was written in 1870, declining attendance to Vatican I. And he is ever so gentle, polite, and scholarly, and he confesses the faith of the Catholic Church, not the false Catholic Church. But anyways, Paul is a minister to the Gentiles, and Grandpa Murray reminds us of that and gives a host of references. In this epistle, we have not only express reference to that fact, but the writing of the epistle itself proceeds from the sense of commission. It's a good word. Compulsion, divine calling, an obligation that goes with it. The apostle takes particular pains to assure the Christians at Rome that he often proposed to go there. Prevented from fulfilling this desire, he pens the epistle in pursuance of his divinely given apostolic commission. In reading the account, we must take into account the missionary zeal and purpose by which Paul was animated as the apostle to the Gentiles, a consideration which has close bearing upon the complexion of the church at Rome and its place in that orbit which Paul regarded as preeminently the sphere of apostolic labors. Paul's not been to Rome yet. Peter's not been to Rome. Peter's in Antioch working and other places. We need to tell our Roman Catholic friends this. Open the doors and let them come in and study with us. Now we turn our attention, maybe we'll finish this today, to the occasion for the penmanship. When correlated with the account given of Paul's movements in the book of Acts, there are sufficient indications given in the epistle to determine with reasonable certainty the place and time of writing. It is clear that he was on the eve of departure for Jerusalem, with contributions made in Macedonia and Achaia for the poor saints at Jerusalem. See Romans 15:25-29. This would imply, to say the least, that he was near to Macedon and Achaia. The reference to Cenchreae, Romans 16:1, which was a port city a little to the west of Corinth and was a trading post and a seaport town that had connections with Eastern Rome, as did Corinth. And the recommendation of Phoebe, a servant of the church there, who apparently was about to depart for Rome, are further indications of the apostle's whereabouts when he wrote the letter. Furthermore, he speaks of Gaius as his hope, or Gaius, Romans 16:23. In one of his letters to Corinth, he speaks of Gaius, or Gaius, as one of those whom he baptized in Corinth, 1 Corinthians 1:14. There is no good reason to doubt the identity of his host when he wrote to the Romans as the Gaius or Gaius of Corinth. In Acts 20, verses 2 and 3, we are informed that Paul, on his third missionary journey, came to Greece and spent 3 months there. After this, he departed to go to Jerusalem and passed through Macedonia, up north, called Macedon. We're cognizant of Philip of Macedon and Alexander the Great, with all of its history, three and a half centuries before St. Paul, that has consequences for the people of God in the Maccabean period, which we've talked about in our Old Testament studies. That's Macedon up north. Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, Troas, all up in that region. He sailed from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, Acts 20, verse 6, and was hastening to be at Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost. We're in Trinity Sunday, but before that, the week before Trinity was Pentecost Sunday. We use the collect for that. We call ourselves Pentecostals here, not with the shouters and the hollers and the holy rollers, but Pentecost, the Spirit's been spread upon his church and blessed it with gifts and redemption and so many other benefits that we talk about in systematics and catechetical studies. We're Pentecostals, Pentecostal Anglicans, if you will, Pentecostal Presbyterians, or if you're other faith Christians and other faith groups, come on over to the Reformed community. There's Pentecostal Christians elsewhere too, and other affiliations. And the ancient church were Pentecostals. The Spirit of God worked regeneration and new birth. And every elect soul of the Old Testament points that never get mentioned, and we keep mentioning because it doesn't get mentioned, and it needs reaffirmation, re-elevation, reassertion. We are part of the one historic church, Old Testament under differing administrations of the same covenant of redemption. There's New Testament with differing administration and greater simplicity and maybe fullness. We have revelation that was not afforded to the Old Testament church. They had what was sufficient, though, unto justification by faith alone. But I digress. Pentecost. Paul wants to get to Pentecost in Jerusalem with the offering collected from the Greek churches. This would mean that he had left Corinth not later than March of that year. Come on, give us the year here, brother Grandpa Murray. Paul himself, in his speech before Felix, referred to the journey to Jerusalem and says that he came to bring alms and offerings to this nation. Acts 24:17. And we do read in Romans later of his burning desire and that heartfelt desire on Paul, the converted Pharisee, that he wishes he could be accursed for the sake of his Jewish brethren, according to the flesh, if they would but come to Christ. He goes on to note that the elect come to Christ, Jew or Gentile, and that the non-elect are hardened. God gave them a spirit of stupor, that seeing they should not see, hearing they should not hear, which we'll study later on. But he loves his Jewish roots and heritage with a renewed and enlightened understanding after he was subdued and tamed by the ascended Redeemer. There's every good reason, back to Grandpa Murray, to identify this presentation of offerings with the contribution made in Macedonia and Achaia, as referenced in Romans 15:26. The evidence would indicate that the epistle was written from Corinth or vicinity towards the end of Paul's 3-month stay in Greece as he's getting ready to go north and head off to Jerusalem. At the close of his third missionary journey, and I'll just throw out, there may be a fourth journey, but that is for a later study, which is not recorded by Acts, but we'll talk about that maybe as we go. At the end of the third journey, he's getting ready to end it, go to Jerusalem and have his dealings down there. But meanwhile, the letter is prepared in Corinth to be transferred to Rome and the Christians there. The reference to the days of unleavened bread, Acts 20, verse 6, places the departure from Philippi in late March or early April of the year concerned. This means that the epistle must have been written in the early spring of the year. Don't you just love doing his historical work while you're doing exegetical work? And you see why we constantly maintain the Old Testament guild, New Testament guild, systematic theology, church history, practical theology, and cultural theology. Paul's in a pagan world. He's a Jew, converted Jew. And in New Testament studies, we've been discussing the cultural environment in which St. Paul, as the apostle to the Gentiles, found himself. Grandpa Murray goes on, there is a difference of judgment among scholars as to the precise year this journey to Jerusalem took place. Most recently, C.K. Barrett, while admitting that the chronology of Paul's movements cannot be settled beyond dispute, nevertheless considers the date 55 AD, offers fewer difficulties than any other. And I got a nice footnote down here. I'm going to want to. He gloriously refers to Theodore Zahn's Introduction to the New Testament, 3 volumes. Upon considering this, what are the best new introduction volumes? We're working with Professor Barrett, but now that I think about it, Zahn's 3 volumes up there would have been maybe a better choice. It is absolutely exquisite in scholarship. A Lutheran elect brother. I don't know if it's been improved upon. Donald K. Guthrie in his New Testament introduction, that's another masterpiece of scholarship of the highest order. He's a fleet admiral. So is Theodore Zahn. And I might, while I'm at it and digressing, add Donald K. Guthrie's New Testament theology. We've got it over here, and I'm eyeing that in the future. So Prof. Murray refers to that, and Professor Barrett. He also refers to Sandham and Headlam. That's the International Critical Commentary, which is an exegetical commentary. He's over back in there too. Who knows, God willing, what we might do if we keep the book of Romans central. We've got 2 books in one. It goes Romans 1 to 6. We'll be here maybe for some years, God willing. It's just fun to sit in Prof. Murray's class and listen to the good, godly Scots Presbyterian professor who hated Christmas and Easter. No calendar in the Bible. You calendar guys. Anyways, he was a gentleman, and he was a gentleman to the Reformed Episcopalians with his objections, and we note them and we rebut them as need be without breaking fellowship. So 55 AD, early spring, according to Barrett. And Barrett is not alone in claiming for the composition of the epistle such a comparatively early date. I've been under the assumption, without further consideration, of thinking of 58 AD. I forget why I came to that conclusion. I'm going to revisit it here. Encourage you to revisit it. We're postulating again the end of the 3rd missionary journey. Paul's getting ready to leave Philippi. The money has been collected. He's going to go to Jerusalem. The letter having already been written en route in the postage to Rome via Phoebe, a female deaconess, if I can allow or permit that. She certainly was a deacon. The word servant is the same as deacon, diakonos. We'll deal with that under systematics maybe at a later time. More common, however, is the view that the spring in question was that of 58 AD. Although W.M. Ramsey claims 57 AD. The New Testament does not mention dates, and so we are dependent on calculations of this sort derived from other sources respecting the events, as the proconsulship of Gallio, which we read about in Acts 18, coincident with Paul's stay in Corinth on his 2nd missionary journey, Acts 18:1 to 18. And the procuratorship of Porcius Festus, which began towards the end of Paul's captivity at Caesarea. It gives some references here. And it looks like Grandpa Murray's not going to take a position other than to just outline 55, 57, 58. Also, J.B. Lightfoot's commentary on Galatians. And I just forget how I came to 58. I may have absorbed it more than analyzed it. In the complexity is over here in the New Testament Guild, which over here in Practical Theology, notice, brothers and sisters, while we discuss these arcane and esoteric issues in the back streets of New Testament scholarship, at least this much, if you're bored, that there's a love and devotion to the New Testament, even though you might not follow all the details, that you can at least recognize your brothers and sisters who are laboring in the Word. Try and figure it out. Try and figure epistles out. Studying the ancient Greek to get close to it. Give thanks for the gifts of God in the history of the church. Well, now, without answering the question from Grandpa Murray, he turns his attention to the church which is at Rome. It looks like this is going to go on for 5 pages. That's going to take us a few video sessions tomorrow and the next day, God willing. The church at Rome. This is going to be fascinating. It was not through Paul, and by way of background, I might encourage you to read the history of Rome. Edward Gibbons, he comes at it as an Enlightenment man, but even though he has that substantive flaw, he's not doing theological history. He's still doing theological history. But in his mind, it's non-theological history. That's a theology he has. He's a non-theological historian. We have to fault him for that. There's no such thing as non-theological history. God commands all the facts of the universe. Having quibbled there and indulged your patience again, we'd call your attention to his magnum opus, The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. It's marvelous to have, we're getting a break in electrical power here. Flash of the lights, the electronics, we're still here. It's great to have a classics background in the approach to New Testament studies, to know the history of the Roman Empire. We're talking about that briefly in New Testament introduction. So we're talking about an ancient city here that's at least 800 years old BC. And its rise to imperial power, which influences Palestine, and Jesus is born in that period when Palestine was under Roman rule. Jesus dies at the hands of a Roman procurator, judged by not by the Roman law, but more tolerated, where he allowed the malice of the Jews, reprobate Jews, to prevail. Let's start here. And how many Jews were in Rome at this time? I think, if I'm not mistaken, I'll go out on a limb here. I think Edward Gibbons puts it around 1 million. Even if we cut that in half and downsized it to 500,000, we're dealing here with a metropolis. It's connected to the Tiber River down to the, not the Adriatic, I'm drawing a blank, and I sailed up along that coastline so many times. Just drawing a blank. What's the sea between Corsica, Sardinia, and the western coast of Italy? I'll check later. Call it a senior moment. But it connects to that sea at Ostia Port. And just as a historical footnote, Augustine was in Rome for a while, and his mother was with him at Ostia. She died. And really read of those stories of his grief. And he buries her there at Ostia. His good, godly mother. Forget her name offhand. She burned in her the desires of her heart for her son to be converted, which happened under Ambrose's preaching up in Milan. And Augustine goes on to become one of the great writers and thinkers in the history of the church. We could talk about Rome and some of the scholars who arose there and leaders. Let's move forward with Grandpa here for a few more minutes. It was not through Paul's own missionary activity that the church had been established. Fact. The only reasonable inference to be drawn from Paul's own witness that he would not build upon another man's foundation. Romans 15:20, is that the church had not been founded by the labors of another apostle, i.e. Peter. So the church existed, but not through any other apostolic endeavor. How might this have been? My previous musings were that it was established through the testimony and eyewitnesses of those that had been in and around Jerusalem at Passover, Ascension Tide and Whit Sunday or Pentecost Sunday, and that somehow, some way, unrecorded in the book of Acts or church history, any of those particulars, ended up founding a church not just in Rome, but also Naples. Because when Paul, after this journey later comes up, they end up at Naples, and then he goes up the west coast by foot and escort to Rome. I guess I may be getting ahead of Grandpa Murray here. Okay, maybe this is a place for us to stop and pick up tomorrow. We're going to be talking about the city of Rome and Paul, where it's at and what it's like and how the church got there. But once and for all, let's cut the fake Catholics off with their love of Petrine supremacy. They're basically institutional narcissism without institutional humility. We call and there's elect in the Roman Catholic Church. We call them to come on in, sit down and talk. We love you. We don't accept what you teach, but we love you. Well, let's close with prayer. Almighty and ever-living God, we have nothing but what you've given us. We give thanks for your work in the life of Grandpa Murray, Professor Murray, the labor of love that he exhibited and exhibits now today. Though gone, and dead, he yet speaks from the grave. We bless you for these men you've given us and are at different places, even as we speak, in different schools. We thank you for the North American Reformed Seminary. Oh, blessed Lord, raise up young men in the next generation as our theological offspring and for our theological grandchildren. That your word and your glory may be told from generation to generation. Though we live and die, others come to carry on the message. Pray for my students. We in particular pray for the two families that lost children. This and anything else you shall see to be necessary for us, we bring to you through the mediation of our invincible Redeemer, Christ Jesus. Amen. Till next time, tomorrow or the next day, Godspeed.